What kind of brutal truths lie hidden in the dust of forgotten years? What horrors did women face in places beyond the reach of established law and order? What did violence truly look like for women living on the edge of the known world, on the untamed frontier, all the way back in 930? Idea number 10. Psychological terror and isolation. Imagine a woman in the wild lands of 930, perhaps on the edge of the burgeoning Holy Roman Empire, or perhaps amidst the Viking settlements stretching into unknown northern seas, or even on the far-flung borders of the Tang dynasty in Asia. Her life was already a struggle against the elements, against starvation, against the constant threat of illness. But beyond the physical dangers, there lurked a more insidious form of violence, psychological terror, and the crushing weight of isolation. In communities barely clinging to existence, where a single bad harvest could mean widespread hunger, and where a raid by an enemy group could wipe out an entire settlement, the mind could become a torture chamber. Women, often dependent on the men in their lives for protection and provision, were particularly vulnerable to this unseen but deeply damaging form of cruelty. Picture a young woman, perhaps barely a teenager, married off to a man twice her age in a distant, newly settled area. Her family, if they even survived the journey, might be miles, perhaps days or weeks, away across perilous terrain. She finds herself in a small homestead, surrounded by wilderness, with only her new husband and perhaps a few other rough, unfamiliar faces. Her husband might be quick to anger, prone to fits of rage, fueled by the unforgiving life, or perhaps by the strong ales brewed from scarce grains. He might not lay a hand on her, but his words could be weapons, sharp and constant. He might threaten to abandon her, to deny her food, to take away her children, to leave her exposed to the wild animals, or even worse, to the marauding bands that occasionally swept through the frontier lands. These threats, even if never acted upon, hung over her head like a perpetual storm cloud. The sheer lack of recourse, the absence of any authority to appeal to, amplified the terror. There was no elder council to intervene, no distant king's law to protect her, no village community robust enough to shame an abusive husband. Her world was a tiny, fragile bubble, and within that bubble, her husband held almost absolute power. The isolation itself was a weapon. Imagine months passing without seeing another friendly face outside of her immediate household. Letters were non-existent, journeys perilous and rare. If her husband chose to control her movements, to keep her confined to the small cabin or the immediate vicinity of the homestead, her world would shrink to an unbearable degree. She might yearn for news of her old life, for the familiar voices of her mother or sisters, but those connections were severed by vast distances and the harsh realities of travel in 930. This profound loneliness could erode her spirit, making her question her own sanity. Whispers of the wind through the trees might sound like distant screams. Shadows at night might take on monstrous forms. Without human connection, without the validation of others, a woman's sense of self could wither. The psychological pressure to conform, to obey, to endure in silence was immense. Any resistance could be met with the ultimate threat: complete abandonment in a hostile environment, a fate often worse than death. A woman left alone on the frontier in 930 AD would face starvation, exposure, wild beasts, or human predators. The knowledge of this absolute vulnerability was a constant source of fear, skillfully exploited by those who sought to control her. Consider the daily life on such a frontier. The work was endless and backbreaking. From dawn until dusk, preparing meager meals, tending to small plots of land, caring for children, mending clothes, gathering water and firewood. It was a cycle of repetitive, grueling tasks. There was little joy, little respite, and often little appreciation. If a woman's efforts were constantly belittled, if her mistakes were met with harsh condemnation or mockery, her sense of self-worth would plummet. She might be told she was useless, that she was a burden, that she was lucky to have even this harsh life. These verbal abuses, often inflicted daily, chipped away at her resilience. Over time, she might internalize these messages, coming to believe she truly was worthless, incapable of independent thought or action. This form of psychological violence, though leaving no visible marks, could inflict deeper wounds than any physical blow, trapping her in a cycle of fear and self-doubt. Furthermore, superstitious beliefs were rampant in 930 AD, and these beliefs could be twisted into tools of psychological torment. A woman might be blamed for a bad harvest, for the illness of a child, for a streak of ill luck, simply because she was a woman, or perhaps because she was an outsider, or because she had some slight physical difference. Threats of divine retribution, of curses, or of being labeled a witch could be used to control her. These accusations, even if just whispered, carried immense weight in a time when understanding of the natural world was limited and fear of the unknown was widespread. Constant fear of being ostracized, of being seen as an evil influence, could force women into rigid conformity, suppressing their individual spirits and preventing them from seeking any form of personal happiness or expression. The frontier was also a place of constant anxiety regarding raids and warfare. News of approaching hostile groups, whether they were rival tribes, desperate outlaws, or organized invaders, would spread like wildfire, igniting widespread terror. For women, this fear was often compounded by the knowledge that they were prime targets for capture, enslavement, or sexual violence. The psychological toll of living under such a constant threat of invasion, never knowing when their home might be plundered or their families torn apart, was immense. Men might channel this fear into preparing for battle, sharpening weapons and building defenses, but women were often left to endure the dread, powerless to truly protect themselves or their children. The mental image of what might happen, the stories whispered of previous raids, served as a constant grinding psychological pressure. Even in periods of relative peace, the memory of past horrors and the anticipation of future ones created a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety, impacting every aspect of a woman's daily life and decision-making. This unremitting fear, coupled with the profound isolation, formed a brutal invisible cage around women on the frontier. Number 9. Infanticide, or exposure of female children. The dawn on the frontier in 930 Advern was not always a time of hope, especially for a newborn girl. While it might seem a cruel twist of fate, one of the most devastating forms of violence often exerted indirectly but powerfully upon women was the practice of infanticide or exposure, particularly targeting female children. This was not a direct physical assault on an adult woman, but it was a profound act of violence against her future, her lineage, her emotional well-being, and indeed against the very concept of womanhood itself. Women were often forced into complicity, pressured by harsh economic realities, social norms, or the absolute authority of the male head of the household to commit or allow this ultimate act of rejection. The frontier, by its very nature, exacerbated the conditions under which such terrible decisions might be made. Life on the frontier was a brutal struggle for survival. Resources were scarce, and every mouth to feed was a significant drain on a family's limited supply of food, water, and shelter. In such desperate circumstances, difficult choices were often made regarding which children were deemed more likely to contribute to the family's survival and prosperity. Sons in many societies of 930 were viewed as future laborers, protectors, and inheritors of land or property. They could hunt, clear land, defend the homestead, and carry on the family name. Daughters, while valuable for domestic labor and for forming alliances through marriage, were often perceived as an economic burden in their earliest years. They required care and feeding for years before they could contribute significantly, and upon marriage they often left the family, taking their labor with them, and sometimes even requiring a dowry or bride price that impoverished their birth family. This stark economic calculus, while not universal, was tragically prevalent in many frontier societies struggling to establish themselves. Imagine a woman giving birth in a rough-hewn cabin, far from any experienced midwife or healer. The process itself was fraught with danger for both mother and child. If the child was a girl, and the family was already teetering on the brink of starvation, or if there were already several daughters and no sons, the pressure from her husband or his family could be overwhelming. It was not uncommon for a newborn, particularly a girl, to be exposed left outdoors to die of exposure or wild animals, or subtly neglected until she perished. This was often done shortly after birth, a silent, heartbreaking decision made in the dim light of a flickering lamp hidden from view. While it was the child who died, the psychological trauma inflicted upon the mother who had carried and birthed that life was immense. She might be forced to participate in this act, or at the very least, to silently acquiesce, forever carrying the burden of that choice. The violence here was against her natural maternal instincts, against her emotional health, and against her right to nurture her child. Historical accounts, though sparse for this specific time and place, suggest that selective infanticide was a hidden scar across many cultures where resources were constrained or male lineage was paramount. On a frontier where social structures were fluid and traditional oversight was weak, such practices could persist without challenge. There was no robust legal system to punish such acts, nor often a strong enough communal morality to condemn them universally. The focus was survival, and individual lives, especially those deemed less vital to the collective struggle, could be sacrificed. For the mothers, the weight of this loss was often borne in silence, a grief too terrible to speak aloud, lest they be seen as defying the very survival logic of their community. This internal violence, the suppression of a mother's natural bond, was a profound and lasting injury. Furthermore, the very act of knowing that a girl child might be considered expendable before she even drew her first breath created a pervasive atmosphere of devaluation for all women. If female infants could be so easily discarded, what did that say about the worth of adult women? It reinforced a societal message that women were secondary, their lives conditional upon their perceived utility to men or to the continuation of the male line. This subtle but powerful form of violence, the constant threat of erasure, permeated the lives of women on the frontier. It shaped their understanding of their own vulnerability, their perceived value, and their role in a harsh world where their very existence could be precarious from the moment of their birth. The specter of infanticide, even if not directly experienced by every woman, was a chilling reminder of the gendered violence embedded within the very foundation of frontier society, a silent scream echoing through the wilderness. Number 8. Violence related to perceived dishonor or transgression. On the frontier of 930 AD, where formal laws were often distant whispers and social order was fragile, personal and communal honor held immense sway. For women, this concept of honor was a treacherous landscape, often leading to severe forms of violence if they were perceived to have transgressed unspoken rules or brought shame upon their families or communities. The definition of honor could be narrow and unforgiving, often tied to a woman's perceived purity, obedience, or adherence to rigid social roles. Any deviation, real or imagined, could unleash a brutal storm of retribution, transforming the quest for order into an excuse for violence. Imagine a young woman perhaps accused of an illicit liaison, or suspected of defying her father or husband's wishes, or even simply for attracting unwanted attention from an outsider. In a settled village with established customs and perhaps a local elder or religious authority, there might be a process, however flawed, for dealing with such accusations. On the frontier, however, justice was often swift, brutal, and dispensed by those closest to the perceived transgression. A father or brother feeling their family standing compromised by a daughter's or sister's actions might resort to extreme physical violence. This could range from severe beatings intended to correct behavior and reassert dominance to more permanent and devastating actions. The intent was not necessarily to kill, but to inflict enough pain and humiliation to cleanse the dishonor and restore the family's reputation in the eyes of their small, isolated community. Consider the powerful role of rumor and gossip in close-knit, isolated frontier settlements, with little entertainment and high-stakes struggles for survival. Any deviation from accepted norms could quickly become the subject of intense scrutiny and speculation. A whisper of impropriety, a perceived act of defiance, or even a misunderstanding could escalate rapidly, fueled by fear, jealousy, or a desire for social control. A woman deemed unchaste could find herself ostracized, verbally abused, or subjected to public humiliation. Such treatment, while not always involving direct physical blows, constituted a profound form of psychological and social violence, effectively stripping her of her standing, her dignity, and her very humanity within her community. In an environment where survival depended on communal cooperation, such isolation could be a death sentence, leading to starvation, exposure, or a vulnerability to other forms of violence. The frontier also brought together diverse peoples, sometimes with clashing traditions and understandings of honor. A woman from one culture might unintentionally violate a deeply held custom of another, leading to severe consequences. For example, a Viking woman might have more personal autonomy than a Slavic woman, and if these cultures intersected, a seemingly innocent act by one could be viewed as a grave insult by the other. This cultural clash could expose women to violence that they could not have anticipated or understood. In these situations, men from the offended group might feel compelled to take justice into their own hands, often targeting the woman as the symbol of the perceived affront. Such incidents highlight the dangerous interplay of cultural differences and the brutal enforcement of honor codes in lawless territories. Beyond physical violence and public shaming, there was also the threat of being disowned or cast out. For a woman on the frontier in 930, losing the protection of her family or husband was akin to being condemned to a life of destitution or a swift death. Without male kin, she would struggle to survive, to claim land, or to protect herself from predators, both human and animal. The fear of this ultimate abandonment, of being stripped of all social support, served as a powerful coercive force, ensuring compliance with strict, often arbitrary rules of conduct. The violence of dishonor was not just about the pain inflicted, but about the systematic dismantling of a woman's life, her identity, and her very means of survival in a world that offered little mercy to the unprotected. Quest for perceived honor often overshadowed any notion of fairness or compassion, making women easy targets in a brutal landscape. Number 7. Violence related to accusations of witchcraft and superstitious attacks. In the dimly lit world of 930, and especially on the untamed frontier, the line between natural phenomena and supernatural forces was blurred beyond recognition. Fear of the unknown, scarcity of resources, sudden illnesses, or unexplained deaths often led communities to seek scapegoats. And women, particularly those who were elderly, childless, or somehow outside the established social norms, frequently became targets of accusations of witchcraft or malevolent sorcery. This was a horrifying form of violence, driven by mass hysteria and deeply ingrained superstitions, and it could lead to brutal attacks, torture, and death. Imagine a small frontier settlement perhaps battling a lingering illness that takes children, or experiencing a series of crop failures that threaten starvation. Panic sets in, and the desperate villagers look for an explanation beyond the harsh realities of their existence. A woman who lives alone, or one who possesses some knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, or even simply one with an unusual appearance or temperament, could become the focal point of their fear. Whispers would begin, tales of strange occurrences linked to her presence or accusations of her causing misfortune through dark magic. These rumors, born of fear and ignorance, could rapidly escalate into outright violence. The violence of witchcraft accusations rarely began with formal trials, especially on the lawless frontier. Instead, it often started with mob rule, with terrified or enraged neighbors taking matters into their own hands. A woman suspected of witchcraft might be subjected to ordeals, brutal tests designed to prove her guilt or innocence, but often rigged against her. She might be thrown into water with the belief that if she floated, she was guilty, as the pure water would reject her, and if she sank, she was innocent, but likely drowned. She might be burned with hot irons, with festering wounds, seen as proof of her unholy nature. These tests were nothing short of torture, designed to extract confessions or to inflict suffering that served as a form of justice. In the absence of any established legal system, the physical scars of such ordeals would be permanent, but the psychological torment, the fear of being hunted by one's own community, would be even deeper. Even if a woman survived such an ordeal, her life might be irrevocably destroyed. She would be ostracized, marked as an outcast, and forever feared. Her property might be seized, her family might disown her to protect themselves, and she would live in constant peril, vulnerable to further attacks or even murder at the hands of those who still believed her to be a source of evil. This societal rejection, this systematic stripping away of her place within the community, was a profound form of violence that could lead to a slow, agonizing death through starvation, exposure, or despair. The fear of witchcraft also served as a tool of social control, particularly over women who might challenge the established order. A woman who was too outspoken, too independent, or too knowledgeable could easily be accused of having unnatural powers, silencing her and reinforcing patriarchal structures. This was a particularly insidious form of violence because it turned fear into a weapon against female autonomy and intellect. Any woman who stepped outside the very narrow confines of her prescribed role risked being branded a witch, a fate that promised unimaginable suffering and a brutal end. On the frontier, where new communities were forming and old traditions were being reestablished, the enforcement of these norms through superstitious violence could be especially harsh and arbitrary, leaving women with little room to breathe or to be themselves without fear of reprisal. Number 6. Economic exploitation and debt bondage. Life on the frontier in 930 AD was a constant battle against scarcity. Resources were limited, harvests could fail, and the threat of famine was ever present. In this precarious environment, economic exploitation became a pervasive form of violence, particularly against women, often without rights to own land, control their labor, or inherit property independently. Women were incredibly vulnerable to systems that could trap them in endless cycles of debt or forced labor, effectively reducing them to commodities. Imagine a small family on a newly settled piece of land. A bad winter, an unexpected illness, or a raid might leave them utterly destitute. To survive, they might be forced to borrow from a wealthier neighbor, a chieftain, or a merchant passing through. Terms of such loans were often brutal, with exorbitant interest rates. When the debt could not be repaid in coin or goods, the family might be forced to offer their labor, and often it was the women and children who were offered first. A wife might be given over to work for the creditor, or even her daughters. This was not a voluntary arrangement. It was a desperate act of survival under duress, driven by the threat of starvation or the loss of their meager homestead. This arrangement, known as debt bondage, could effectively turn a woman into a chattel, a possession to be used to settle an obligation. Once in debt bondage, a woman's life became a ceaseless round of grueling labor. She might be forced to work in fields, tend to livestock, or perform domestic duties for her new master. Her hours would be long, her food meager, and her living conditions often deplorable. She would have no say in her work, no ability to refuse, and no hope of escape as long as the debt remained unpaid. The debt, often calculated to be nearly impossible to clear, could be passed down through generations, effectively enslaving entire families. This was a form of slow violence, stripping a woman of her autonomy, her dignity, and her future. She was reduced to her physical capacity for work, her humanity utterly disregarded. Beyond formal debt bondage, women were also vulnerable to more subtle forms of economic exploitation within their own households or communities. In many frontier societies, men controlled all significant resources: land, livestock, and trade goods. Women's labor, though essential for survival, was often uncompensated or undervalued. They might spend their days processing food, weaving textiles, crafting tools, or raising children, contributing immensely to the household's survival, yet they had no control over the fruits of their labor. Their ability to earn their own keep, to accumulate even small amounts of wealth, was severely limited. This lack of economic independence made them profoundly vulnerable. A husband could deny his wife necessities, use her labor without providing adequately for her, or even sell her into a form of servitude to settle his own debts. The implicit threat of destitution ensured a woman's compliance, turning her daily grind into a form of coerced labor. For those women who were widows or had no male kin, the situation was even more dire. Without the protection of a husband or a male relative, they were often preyed upon, their meager possessions stolen, their land usurped, and their labor forcibly commandeered. There was no functioning legal system on the frontier to protect their rights, and they were often seen as easy targets. The violence here was not just physical but systemic. The denial of economic agency, the forced servitude, and the perpetual threat of destitution that loomed over every woman who lacked male protection or independent means. It was a violence that stripped women of their self-sufficiency, trapping them in a cycle of dependence and exploitation, their lives dictated by the whims of those who held economic power. Number 5. Forced marriages for political or economic gain. In the volatile world of the 930 frontier, where alliances shifted like desert sands and survival often depended on fragile bonds, between families or groups, marriage was frequently stripped of any romantic notion and became a grim instrument of power. For women, this often meant being forced into unions for political or economic gain, a profound form of violence that disregarded their personal desires, their bodily autonomy, and their emotional well-being. They were treated as commodities, bartered and traded to forge peace, secure land, or consolidate influence, their lives sacrificed on the altar of male ambition and communal survival. Imagine a daughter of a tribal chieftain or a prominent settler family, perhaps barely a teenager, suddenly informed that she was to be married to a man from a rival clan or a powerful neighbor. This might be a complete stranger, a man much older than her, perhaps already with several wives, or even someone from a group with whom her own people had been recently at war. Her feelings, her fears, her dreams were utterly irrelevant. The decision would have been made by the men in her family, usually her father, for reasons of strategic advantage. This marriage could be to prevent an impending conflict, to solidify a tenuous peace treaty, to gain access to valuable trading routes or fertile land, or to secure a military alliance against a common enemy. Her role was simply to be the living embodiment of this pact, a human sacrifice for the greater good of her male kin. The violence inherent in these forced marriages was multifaceted. First, there was the profound violation of self. A woman's choice in such a fundamental aspect of her life was completely denied. She was transferred from one patriarchal authority to another, often to a household where she was an outsider, distrusted and expected to bear children who would cement the new alliance. Her very body became a political tool, expected to produce heirs that would blend the bloodlines and ensure the longevity of the agreement. Resisting such a marriage was almost impossible. Disobedience could bring severe punishment upon herself and her family, including ostracism, physical abuse, or even warfare. The threat of violence, both personal and communal, loomed over any attempt to refuse. Furthermore, once married, her life in her new household could be fraught with hardship and isolation. She might not speak the same language as her new family, or share their customs and beliefs. She could face hostility from other wives if her husband was a polygamist, or suspicion from her new community. Her husband, who might view her as merely a political pawn, might treat her with indifference, cruelty, or simply as an object for procreation. She would be utterly dependent on him and his family for her survival, with no means of escape. The emotional and psychological toll of such a life, lived without genuine connection or affection, enduring conditions that were forced upon her, was immense. This slow, grinding violence could crush a woman's spirit, leaving her hollowed out and devoid of personal agency. Historical examples from various regions in 930, and from the Byzantine Empire's intricate marriage alliances with neighboring kingdoms to the formation of early medieval European states through strategic unions, underscore this brutal reality. While the frontier might have lacked the elaborate ceremonies of courts, the underlying principle was the same. Women were valuable assets, not for their individual worth, but for their ability to forge and maintain connections between powerful men. This systemic commodification of women, where their lives and bodies were negotiated and traded, was a pervasive form of violence that robbed them of their fundamental human rights and condemned them to lives dictated by external political and economic forces. It was a violence born of necessity and power, leaving a lasting mark on the lives of countless women who were forced to become silent pawns in a grander, often brutal game. Number 4. Deprivation and neglect of basic needs on the unforgiving frontier of 930 AD, where survival itself was a daily struggle. A silent and insidious form of violence against women often unfolded. The systematic deprivation and neglect of basic needs. This was not always an act of overt aggression, but rather a slow, grinding cruelty that could lead to starvation, illness, and death. In harsh environments where resources were scarce and life was precarious, a woman's access to food, shelter, warmth, and medical care could be deliberately limited or simply neglected. In many patriarchal households on the frontier, the men, as the primary hunters or protectors, would often prioritize their own needs or those of their sons. A woman, particularly an elderly one, a widow, or one who had failed to produce male heirs, might find herself at the bottom of the hierarchy when it came to receiving adequate portions of food. She might consistently be given the scraps, the least nutritious parts of the meal, or simply less food overall. Over time, this chronic undernourishment would weaken her, making her susceptible to disease and hindering her ability to perform necessary daily tasks, creating a cruel cycle of further devaluation. Her health would slowly deteriorate, her strength would wane, and her very spirit would dim not from a single blow but from a relentless slow starvation. Shelter was another critical basic need often denied or neglected. Frontier dwellings were often crude, offering limited protection from the elements. If a woman was seen as less valuable, or if her living situation was contingent on the whims of an abusive husband or family, she might be relegated to the coldest, dampest, or most exposed parts of the dwelling. She might be forced to sleep near a leaky roof, or without adequate blankets in freezing temperatures. Constant exposure to harsh weather could lead to chronic illnesses, such as pneumonia, rheumatism, or frostbite, further debilitating her and deepening her suffering. This deliberate or negligent withholding of adequate shelter was a direct threat to her survival, a slow assault on her health and well-being. Access to warmth was also vital in the unforgiving winters of the frontier. Fires were precious, fueled by hard-won firewood. If a woman was denied sufficient access to the warmth of the hearth, especially while performing chores like cooking or tending to children, she would suffer from the cold, her body constantly chilled, her hands and feet numb. This might seem a minor hardship, but in a world without modern medicine or comfortable clothing, constant cold could lead to serious health complications, affecting her circulation, her respiratory system, and her overall vitality. The systematic denial of basic comfort, even a place by the fire, was a form of violence that undermined her ability to simply exist. And finally, medical care, even in its rudimentary 930 AD form, was often withheld or neglected. Childbirth was a deadly ordeal, and women suffered from a myriad of ailments related to continuous pregnancies, harsh labor, and poor nutrition. If a woman fell ill, particularly if she was not seen as essential to the household's immediate survival, or if her illness was deemed inconvenient, she might be left to suffer without any attempts at healing or comfort. There were no frontier doctors, only local healers, or a few traditional remedies passed down through generations. If these were not sought out for her, or if she was actively prevented from accessing them, her illness could quickly become fatal. The absence of care, the deliberate turning away from her suffering, was a profound act of violence, consigning her to a lonely and painful end. This pattern of deprivation and neglect, while not always dramatic or overtly bloody, was a continuous, life-threatening form of violence that eroded women's health, autonomy, and very existence on the frontier. Number 3. Sexual assault in times of conflict or instability. The frontier of 930 AD was a place of constant flux where established order was weak and conflict was often an imminent reality. Whether due to inter-tribal warfare, nomadic incursions, raids by desperate outlaws, or the violent expansion of kingdoms, periods of instability were frequent. In these chaotic times, sexual assault emerged as a horrifying and pervasive form of violence against women, often used as a weapon of war, a tool of subjugation, or simply an act of opportunistic brutality unchecked by any authority. The anonymity of the frontier and the breakdown of social norms provided fertile ground for such atrocities to flourish. Imagine a small settlement caught in the path of a raiding party. The men might be killed or captured, the homes plundered and burned. But for the women, the terror extended beyond the immediate physical threat to their lives. They were often seen as spoils of war, their bodies becoming battlegrounds for the victor's unchecked aggression. Sexual violence in such contexts was not merely an individual crime. It was a deliberate tactic to humiliate the defeated community, to break their spirit, and to assert absolute dominance. The sheer dehumanization involved, the stripping away of a woman's agency and bodily integrity, was profound. There was no recourse, no justice system to appeal to in the aftermath. Trauma would last a lifetime, often compounded by unwanted pregnancies, the contraction of diseases, and the indelible psychological scars that no passage of time could fully heal. Beyond formal conflict, the general lawlessness of the frontier created an environment where women were vulnerable to sexual assault from within their own communities or from transient individuals. With no established police force or judicial system, perpetrators often acted with impunity. A woman working alone in a field, collecting water from a distant spring, or traveling between settlements was at immense risk. If she was attacked, her cries for help might go unheard, and even if she managed to survive and report the assault, there was often little to no justice. Perpetrator might be a powerful member of the community, or simply a man too strong or feared to be challenged. In many frontier societies, the blame for sexual assault was often shifted to the victim, who might be accused of enticing the attack or of damaging her own honor. This victim blaming, coupled with the lack of legal recourse, compounded the violence, leaving women feeling utterly unprotected and isolated. The very concept of a frontier implied a loosening of traditional moral codes and a rise in opportunistic behavior. Men living on the edge of society, often far from their families or any stabilizing social influences, might have felt emboldened to commit acts they would not in a more regulated environment. Alcohol, already a common vice, might have fueled such acts. The lack of witnesses, the sparse population, and the vast unmonitored spaces provided an ideal landscape for such crimes to occur and remain unpunished. For women, this meant a constant state of hypervigilance, an unending fear for their personal safety. They were forced to navigate a world where a wrong turn, an ill-timed journey, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could lead to an unspeakable horror. Historical records, though often sonnenhide or incomplete, frequently hint at the brutal realities of wartime sexual violence and the pervasive vulnerability of women in chaotic periods. From the sagas describing Viking raids to accounts of nomadic conquests in Central Asia, the capture and violation of women were grim parts of the narrative. On the frontier of 930, this particular form of violence was a chilling constant, a horrifying reminder that in the absence of law and order, the most basic human rights, especially those of women, were often the first casualties. The legacy of such assaults was not just the physical pain, but the enduring psychological devastation that rippled through individuals and communities, forever altering the lives of survivors. Number 2. Abduction and forced servitude. Life on the frontier in 930. Oud was a precarious existence, and one of the most terrifying and common forms of violence women faced was abduction and subsequent forced servitude or enslavement. Whether carried out by raiding parties, opportunistic bandits, or even as a grim consequence of economic hardship within one's own community, the act of being forcibly taken from one's home and stripped of freedom was a life-shattering experience. It was a complete annihilation of identity, reducing a human being to property, to be bought, sold, or used at the whim of another. Imagine a woman perhaps foraging for berries or tending to a small flock of sheep on the outskirts of her settlement. Suddenly, she is ambushed, dragged away, silenced, and bound. Her cries for help are lost in the vast wilderness. She might be taken by a rival tribe seeking to bolster their numbers, by outlaws looking for labor or a ransom, or by slave traders who saw human beings as just another commodity to be exploited. The initial shock and terror of the abduction itself would be immense, as her entire world was ripped apart in an instant. She would be forced to march for days, perhaps weeks, often in chains or ropes under harsh conditions, with little food or water, never knowing her destination or what fate awaited her. The journey itself was a brutal form of violence, wearing down her body and spirit. Upon arrival at her new home, her ordeal would continue. She would be forced into servitude, her labor extracted for the benefit of her captors. This could mean endless days of back-breaking toil in fields, performing arduous domestic chores, or being used as a concubine. She would have no rights, no property, and no autonomy. Her name might be changed, her language forbidden, and her connections to her past deliberately severed. Any defiance or refusal to work could be met with severe physical punishment, starvation, or even death. The violence here was not just physical restraint, but the complete denial of selfhood, systematic breaking of her will, and the imposition of a life devoid of dignity or choice. She was no longer a person, but a tool, a resource to be used and discarded. Forced servitude on the frontier was not always the result of a sudden raid. In some cases, women might be given into servitude to settle debts, or as a form of tribute or punishment. A family might be forced to give up a daughter to a more powerful leader or group to avoid conflict or starvation. While technically not an abduction, the coercion involved was absolute, and the outcome for the woman was largely the same: a life of forced labor and subjugation. These forms of violence often occurred in the shadows, far from any centralized authority, making them almost impossible to track or prevent. The remote nature of the frontier meant that escape was often impossible, and even if a woman did manage to flee, she would face the immense challenges of surviving in a hostile wilderness, often alone, hunted, and without resources. Historical accounts from various frontiers in 930 add from the expansion of the Norse in Europe to the conflicts between nomadic groups in Central Asia frequently mention the taking of captives, especially women and children, for purposes of slavery or servitude. These captives were then integrated into the conqueror's society, their original identities stripped away, their lives defined by their new status as property. The violence of abduction and forced servitude was a stark reminder of the fragile nature of freedom and the brutal consequences of lawlessness on the frontier, transforming women into mere tools for the survival or enrichment of others, their cries for liberty unheard in the vast, uncaring wilderness. Number 1. Domestic brutality and physical abuse. Even in the most remote corners of the frontier, in 930, at far from the grand castles and bustling marketplaces, the most pervasive and often hidden form of violence, against brutality and physical abuse. In a world where patriarchal structures were deeply entrenched, where women often had few legal rights, and where isolation and hardship bred short tempers and desperation, the home which should have been a sanctuary could become a battleground. This was a silent epidemic, leaving its victims with both visible scars and invisible wounds, often without any hope of escape or recourse. Imagine a woman living in a small, rough cabin on the edge of a vast forest or windswept plain. Her life is one of constant toil, from dawn to dusk, raising children, preparing meager meals, tending to a small garden, and managing the household. Her husband, perhaps burdened by the immense pressures of survival, of defending his land, or simply by the harshness of the frontier life, might see her as little more than property, an extension of himself. Frustration, fear, or drunkenness could easily ignite his temper, leading to violent outbursts. A single perceived transgression, a meal not cooked to his liking, a child crying too loudly, a task left undone, could be enough to unleash a torrent of physical abuse. The forms of this violence were varied and brutal. She might endure punches, kicks, slaps, or being thrown across the room. Objects found in the rough frontier dwelling, tools, sticks, or even cookware could be used as weapons. There was no one to intervene. Neighbors might be miles away, or, if nearby, might adhere to the prevailing societal norm that a man's household was his domain, and his actions within it were his own business. The absence of any official law enforcement or judicial system meant that there were no consequences for the perpetrator. A woman might be beaten severely, left bruised and broken, but unable to seek justice or protection. Her injuries might heal, but the fear, the humiliation, and the constant threat of recurrence would linger, shaping every aspect of her daily existence. This physical violence was not just about inflicting pain. It was about asserting absolute control. A man's power over his wife and children was often unchallenged on the frontier. She was expected to be obedient, subservient, and to endure hardship in silence. Any sign of defiance or independence could be met with intensified brutality, designed to break her spirit and ensure her compliance. The isolation of the frontier compounded her vulnerability. There was no escape route, no safe house, no distant family to turn to. She was often entirely dependent on her abuser for food, shelter, and protection from the outside world. This dependence, coupled with the lack of options, trapped women in cycles of abuse from which it was nearly impossible to break free. Moreover, the physical abuse often existed alongside other forms of violence mentioned, such as psychological terror, economic exploitation, or deprivation. A woman might be beaten for speaking out, starved as a punishment, or denied basic care after an assault, further entrenching her subjugation. The constant physical threat, the fear of the next blow, instilled a profound sense of helplessness and resignation. Historical accounts from various frontier settings, though rarely detailing specific instances of domestic violence from 930, I'd consistently depict a world where men held immense power over women, and physical discipline within the household was often considered a legitimate means of control. For countless women on the frontier, the most dangerous place was not the untamed wilderness or the path of a raiding party, but the very home they shared with their abuser, where violence was a constant, terrifying companion.